There's a moment that happens to a lot of people around the middle of the month. You check your account and the number is lower than it should be. You do the rough math in your head, the bills, the groceries, the few things you bought, and it doesn't quite add up to the deficit you're looking at. Something is missing and you're not entirely sure what. So you shrugged, you tell yourself you'll be more careful, and you move on. And then the end of the month arrives and there's almost nothing left. And you get paid again, and for a few days things feel okay, and then the cycle starts over. Same month, different number at the top, same empty account at the bottom. If you've been in this cycle for more than a year, you've probably already tried the surface level fixes. You've tracked spending for a week or two before losing interest. You've cut something out temporarily. You've told yourself this month will be different and believed it, genuinely, and watched it not be different. And at some point, after enough cycles, the conclusion most people arrive at is that they're just not good with money, that some people have whatever it takes to accumulate and they don't, that the problem is fundamental, personal, and probably permanent. That conclusion is wrong, and the reason it's wrong matters, because believing it is part of what keeps the cycle running. The one pattern keeping most people broke is not a spending habit. It's not a specific category of purchase you need to eliminate. It's not a lack of financial knowledge or an income problem, though income obviously matters at a certain level. The pattern is something more fundamental and more invisible than any of those things. It's the way your financial life is structured in relation to how your brain actually makes decisions. And the two are almost perfectly misaligned in a way that guarantees the same outcome regardless of intention. Here's the core of it. Most people manage money. Money arrives, it sits in the account, and it gets spent on whatever arises, with whatever is left over, theoretically available, for saving or building. The assumption underneath this structure is that spending will be governed by conscious choice, that you will naturally spend less than you earn if you just pay attention and try hard enough. But this assumption ignores something fundamental about how decisions actually happen in the human brain, particularly financial decisions, particularly in a world engineered to extract those decisions from you as efficiently as possible. The human brain, when presented with money that appears available, treats it as available, not as a portion of a larger plan, not as a number that has obligations attached to it, just as a resource that exists and can be used. And so it gets used, gradually, in ways that each feel reasonable in the moment, until the account is empty and the pattern completes itself again. The problem isn't that you're spending on the wrong things. The problem is that you're making spending decisions from a position where all the money feels like it belongs to the present, when in reality, some of it needs to belong to the future. And without a structure that physically separates those two categories, before you can spend either, your brain will consistently and predictably choose the present. This is where things get strange. Research on how people actually make financial decisions, as opposed to how they think they make them, reveals a consistent and humbling pattern. The amount available in a checking account strongly predicts how much will be spent that month, across income levels, across financial knowledge levels, across stated intentions and goals. When people have more sitting in the account, they can see, they spend more. When they have less, they spend less, not because they made different decisions, because the amount visible changed what felt normal, what felt available, what the brain calibrated to as the baseline for that month's spending. This means that managing money by looking at what's in the account and deciding what to spend is a fundamentally unreliable system, because the number you're looking at is doing the deciding for you more than you are. The people who break out of the broke cycle don't do it by becoming more disciplined. They do it by changing the structure so that discipline is no longer required at the moment of spending. They remove the decision from the dangerous zone, the zone where money is sitting in the account, appearing available, competing with every immediate desire and obligation, and they move it before it ever enters that zone. Money that is automatically redirected to a separate account before it becomes psychologically available to spend doesn't feel like deprivation. It feels like it never existed, and the brain calibrates to what remains. The same brain that overspent when the account was full will underspend when the account shows less, not because the person changed, because the default changed. What most people miss is how profoundly the order of financial operations matters. The conventional approach is earn, spend, save what's left. The problem with this sequence is that what's left is almost always nothing, or very little, because spending naturally expands to meet availability. The functional approach inverts it. Earn, save first, spend what remains. Not a large amount necessarily, not a painful sacrifice, just enough to shift the default, to make the account that governs your daily spending show a smaller number than your actual income, so that the brain's tendency to calibrate to availability works in your favor rather than against you. This sounds almost too simple. It sounds like advice you've heard before. But there's a difference between knowing this and structuring your actual financial life around it. Most people who know this haven't actually implemented it, because implementation requires a moment of friction, of setting up the transfer, of adjusting to a slightly smaller number in the visible account. And that moment of friction feels like the start of deprivation. It isn't. The discomfort lasts a few days. The structural benefit lasts indefinitely. But the brain, which is always more sensitive to immediate cost than to distant benefit, finds reasons to delay. And in the delay, the month passes, and the cycle completes again. There's a deeper layer underneath this that explains why even people who understand the structure often struggle to implement it, and it has to do with the identity that has formed around financial struggle. When you've been broke for long enough, something shifts in how you relate to money. It starts to feel like a reflection of who you are, rather than a description of your current situation. And that shift is dangerous, because it means that every time you attempt to change your financial behavior, you're not just changing a habit, you're contradicting an identity. And contradicting an identity produces resistance that feels irrational but isn't, because the brain's investment in maintaining a consistent self-image is real and powerful. This shows up in specific, recognizable ways. The person who finally saves a small amount and then spends it on something unplanned, as if the account being full was uncomfortable and needed to be emptied. The person who receives unexpected money and immediately disperses it, rather than letting it accumulate, because accumulation feels unfamiliar and somehow wrong. The person who makes more money and finds their expenses rise in exact proportion, as if the financial position needs to stay constant regardless of the input. These aren't failures of discipline. They're expressions of an identity that has quietly decided that broke is what you are, and that any deviation from it needs to be corrected. Changing that identity doesn't require therapy or a major psychological overhaul. It requires evidence. Specifically, it requires small, repeated experiences of behaving differently from the identity that is formed, until the accumulation of those experiences starts to build a new story about who you are in relation to money. Every month that ends with something saved, even a small amount, is a data point against the old story. Every automatic transfer that runs without being cancelled is a vote for a different identity. These things don't feel significant in the moment. Across time, they're the entire mechanism. There is also the question of what money represents emotionally, and this is worth sitting with honestly. For many people, spending money is one of the most accessible forms of agency they experience in daily life. A life that feels constrained, or pressured, or joyless, or controlled in various ways, becomes briefly less so in the moment of a purchase. The spending isn't really about the thing purchased. It's about the feeling of choosing, of treating yourself, of asserting some small control over a life that often doesn't feel entirely yours. And when that emotional function is operating, no budget can fully compete with it. Because the budget is a financial tool, and the spending is meeting an emotional need that the budget doesn't address. Understanding this doesn't mean surrendering to it. It means recognizing that some portion of your spending needs to be consciously protected as legitimate, guilt-free, yours to use for whatever feels good, so that the emotional function is served within a structure rather than in opposition to it. People who approach financial change with total restriction, who treat every discretionary purchase as a failure, tend to break the restriction rather than sustain it, because the emotional pressure builds until it overflows. People who protect a defined guilt-free spending category within an overall structure that saves first tend to maintain the structure because the restriction doesn't feel there's room for the human inside the system. The broke cycle isn't a life sentence. It isn't proof of who you are or what you're capable of. It's the predictable output of a structure that was never designed to produce a different result, running against the grain of how your brain actually makes decisions, in an environment specifically engineered to extract money from you at every available moment. Change the structure, and the output changes. Not because you became someone different, but because the conditions finally stopped working against you. The first transfer doesn't have to be large. It just has to happen before the month does. If this felt familiar, comment staying broke. It helps me know this is something more people are silently dealing with.